Spiritus Refletorum Corada Fidelium, et tuia morisine signum accende, mite Spiritum tuum et crea voluntur.
Et nobis pacem Dei.
Oremus Deus qui corada Fidelium, Sancti Spiritus illustrat sine nocuisti, dada bis in iodum Spiritu recta sapere, et de eius semper consolatione godere per Christum Dominum nostrum.
Amen.
Sede sapientiae,
Ora pro nobis.
in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Continuing on with the pontificate of Pope Liberius. And who is actually in some places listed as actually being canonized. And as we said last time, there is never a question of his actually adhering to or professing, or certainly not of teaching heresy. That's actually never been the controversy, ever. The controversy was only whether he, in a moment of weakness, due to the pressure of years of persecution, after having endured exile for a matter of years, because of precisely of refusing to compromise on matters of faith, whether he eventually, due to the urgings of his own people, in fact, signed an ambiguous declaration of faith to which he gave an orthodox interpretation, which in fact could receive one, which in fact St. Hilary of Poitiers himself defended as being capable of an orthodox interpretation. The only question is whether he signed such a declaration in a moment of weakness, which was, in other words, committing to this, something which was not a good idea because of tremendous pressure that had been exerted upon him for years at that point to do that. That is about the extent of the controversy, not whether he ever professed error, and not certainly never whether he taught it. And so that is the nature of the controversy. That is the nature of the debated historical point. So the emperor doubtless promised to attend. So the Roman ladies, remember, enjoined that nobody entered the church while Felix was there, the anti-pope Felix, who had been foisted upon the church, or at least upon Rome, in the absence of Pope Liberius, a true anti-pope, who was never elected, never validly elected, and who could not possibly come to power simply by being there for a while, not even by being accepted by the city of Rome for a while, or by sitting there without open opposition, because you see there was we'll say active opposition without any efforts to remove him, because he was not in fact accepted at all. I remember that when it comes to the civil power, generally peaceful acceptance is sufficient for becoming legitimate. Whereas in the case of a pope, he has to actually be validly designated, and nobody can remove that from him without, even in the case of, it's debated whether in the case of a pope who becomes a heretic, how exactly it works. Everybody agrees that a pope who becomes personally a heretic can be removed. The question is, how does that work? It's debated among authors. That was never really clearly settled. But that's not the case here at all. This is a case of somebody who has intruded without having been elected at all. And the designation cannot be transferred from a true pope to him, to such a claimant, under these circumstances. It is possible that a true pope resign, for example, and allow someone else to take the place of the vicar of Christ on earth, but that has not happened here. Pope Liberius is clearly never going to resign, and this Felix is clearly never going to be accepted by faithful Catholics. So there's no question at all of his legitimacy. He's clearly illegitimate. That is the situation of this anti-pope Felix. Remember, the faithful of the city of Rome are generally, there may have been some instances of people accepting Felix, but not not on the whole for sure. And in fact, this anti-Pope Felix is rejected by just about everybody. And the Roman ladies, or the matrons of the city of Rome, enjoined that nobody enter the church while Felix was there, for though he kept the Nicene faith, he still held communion with those who corrupted it. So, of course, he's an anti-pope, falsely claiming to be pope, and also he is maintaining communion with those who who are in fact heretics. So keep that in mind also. That if this accusation that Pope Liberius excommunicated St. Athanasius, who was very prominent for defending the faith, and instead, so if Pope Liberius had excommunicated St. Athanasius and had instead maintained communion with heretics, how would he have been received in Rome? If one of the reasons for rejecting Felix, the anti-Pope Felix, was that he's not a heretic himself, but he holds communion with those who are heretics. Now, how would Pope Liberius have been received in Rome if that had been true, that he had cut off communion with someone who held the faith, but instead admitted to communion those who did not? So the emperor doubtless promised to attend to their request, for some time after, he wrote to Rome announcing that Liberius was to be recalled and to govern the church in conjunction with Felix. Obviously, that's not going to work. When the letter was read in the circus, the people ironically exclaimed, "That is just indeed." So they're saying this sarcastically. They don't mean this actually. They're pointing out when they're saying that is just indeed, what they're actually doing is pointing out an injustice. As there are two factions in the circus, distinguished by their colors, each one will have its bishop. Having thus expressed their contempt for the imperial letter, they cried out with one voice, "One God, one Christ, one bishop." So this is correct. And most of the time you hear about the people of the city of Rome crying out in some way. It's usually the Roman mob causing trouble. In this case, it's the faithful of the city of Rome refusing to acknowledge something as absurd as a dual papacy, or anything even remotely resembling that. And what they're saying here is, this is not as though you could have two teams of chariot racers or something, and each team has its captain. And okay, well, whatever that might work in a matter of sport, but this does not work when it comes to matters of faith. The emperor cannot appease us by promising, okay, you have your pope, you have your pope. It doesn't work that way. This is not some political divide to on which to decide things. And by the way, yes, in the times of, certainly this comes into play later on in later centuries in the eastern half of the empire, but that actually became a way for people to express, we'll say, political desires, because in an empire there are no politics officially. There are no politics, there are no political parties, there are no political factions that are allowed. You have the emperor, and the emperor is the ruler until he dies, and his government it's clearly understood, the government that rules by the authority of God. Ultimately, that is the authority that the government exercises. The government of the emperor is invested in the emperor and in his government by God himself, as the author of nature, but still that is the authority of God being manifested there. So why would you go against that? That is the authority of God being exercised and the will of God being manifested through the legitimate ordinances of the government. So why would you oppose that? And so officially there are no political parties allowed, but then the way that certain, let's say, different factions came into being, in fact, if not officially, was by aligning themselves with different groups of chariot racers that identified themselves by different colors. And as actually later on, we'll see that there was an instance in which the Emperor Justinian was almost ousted, but due to, due to people's allegiances to their different chariot racing teams, and things ended up not working out for those who wanted to overthrow him. But that's for a later century. But it's an interesting story, very interesting not only in itself, but also interesting as a way of demonstrating that there is nothing new under the sun. There really is not. Yeah, so that's for later. But here, yes, in the circus, this letter of the emperor announcing his intention to, okay, we'll bring back Pope Liberius, but Felix will also be here as well. And they're saying absolutely, we'll have absolutely no part of that. There is one faith, so there was one God, there was one Christ, we'll only have one bishop of every diocese, of course, but also only one pope of the entire church, only one vicar of Christ on earth, only one visible head of the church on earth. So, notice the commitment of the people to matters of faith, to matters of government in the church. These matters were carried to yet greater extremes. Seditions were excited in Rome, and its streets were even stained with blood. So things are getting a little out of hand here for sure. It was on this account, according to the historian Socrates, that the emperor reluctantly consented to the return of Liberius to his pontifical throne. The admirable Liberius then, says Theodoret, returned to his beloved city. So it's because ultimately due to unrest at the fact that an anti-pope is in place and the true pope is not there, that the emperor, we'll see here, allows the return of Pope Liberius. Other ancient authors inform us that he entered Rome in triumph, that this whole city full of joy went out to meet him and expelled Felix. It may cause some surprise that we make no mention of the fall of Pope Liberius, the famous fall which Bossuet has endeavored at length to prove. We are aware that in his apology for the declaration of the Gallican clergy, Bossuet spares no efforts to try to prove that Liberius fell by subscribing the Arian profession of faith. But we also know from his secretary that in the later revision of the work, Bossuet erased the whole passage concerning Pope Liberius as not proving conclusively enough what he wished at the moment to establish. So remember, Gallicanism is something for later centuries to study in later sections of church history, but essentially the system holding that the church, the Gallican church, the church in France, has special privileges, and that the King of France has special privileges and cannot be censored by the Pope as the King of France, and so on and so forth. All these notions would really just come from an exaggerated French nationalism. That is the root of it all. And excessive nationalism has caused so much trouble in the history of the church. It is because of that schismatic sects arise. Greek and schismatic sects have arisen really just through excessive nationalism. All the pretexts on which those sects were founded are clearly that, nothing more than pretexts, just excuses for them to try to make the church a functionary of the state. That's it. That is the full extent of it. And as we're seeing right now, it doesn't come. The Greek schismatic sect did not come into existence for centuries after this. And notice at this point, everybody everywhere is submitting to the Pope, east and west. Everyone looks to the Pope for decisions and everything. Again, the Council of Nicaea held in the east. Everyone everywhere looking to the Pope for decisions in doctrinal matters. Later centuries, excessive Greek nationalism led to this desire to break from Rome, not to be submitted in any way to the city of Rome. That while actually acknowledging the Pope, the Pope is the Bishop of Rome, he has authority as the Bishop of Rome. He does it. The insistence was he doesn't have any authority in the East, which is false, obviously. But they wanted to throw that off because of their nationalism, and also political pressure. And so, just excuses arising from a desire to be more independent. So, Gallicanism was influenced by excessive French nationalism, and it's realistically Bossuet is a name that comes up. Bishop of Meaux is a name that comes up very frequently. It's actually saying many good things, and he did. But the reason that really can't quote him very much at all is because he was a Gallican. If you quote him on one thing, people might get the impression that he was good unconditionally, and that is not the case. Definitely not. When it comes to talking about the rights of the Holy See, certainly with regard to the French nation, he is going to get things very badly wrong. Again, he either is generally considered to be, so there's a very strong reason to suspect that he was at least the material author of the Declaration of the Gallican Clergy from 1682, which was highly problematic to say the least. But as part of that, he's trying to, in some way, he seeks in certain ways to denigrate the Holy See, such as by pointing out all popes who have been problematic, such as Pope Liberius, who subscribed to this profession of faith handed to him by Arians out of weakness. See how problematic popes can be sometimes. And when you look at the particulars of what's even asserted, it's not even as big a problem as many people would have you believe, and that includes today. But even assuming that as allowing that as the course of events asserted by those who want Pope Liberius to have fallen, it is not nearly as problematic as some would have you believe. Again, people today, to this very day, bring this up as a precedent for recognize and resist, which we've seen already. It's not. I mean, it's just nothing short of absurd to try to assert that this somehow what Pope Liberius did somehow could justify schism. Let's remember, recognize and resist is the very definition of schism. To recognize the Pope, to recognize even the necessity of beings submitted to the Vicar of Christ on earth, but still in a habitual way refusing submission to him. That is the very definition of schism. And to recognize and resist, on one hand, recognizes the necessity of being submitted to the Pope, and in the minds of those who recognize the Novus Ordo hierarchy as being legitimate, and giving them a habitual authority to rule the Church, in their minds, that is acknowledging also a legitimate Pope, and at the same time habitually resisting him in matters of faith and morals. That is the very definition of schism. I mean, you could not get a definition that fit. You could not get an operation that fits the definition to a T more than that. And assuming their version of events, and actually objectively as well, because the Novus Ordo hierarchy, as we know, is not legitimate. But they are submitted. That's another way of being in schism, is to be in communion with a false hierarchy, which they are. They might have, a title to those positions, a certain designation to them, but they don't actually possess those positions legitimately. And so that is also a way of being in schism. So it's schismatic no matter how you look at it, whether they're right or wrong in describing the Novus Ordo hierarchy as being the legitimate hierarchy of the Catholic Church. Whatever the case with regard to that, I would say whatever. Not to say that's unimportant, but abstracting momentarily from considerations of whether they are correct or not, that is still there. It's objectively a schismatic position, no matter what. There's no way to save it. So you groups within the Novus Ordo who at least submit to those whom they say have authority, they are at least consistent. And in that way, they're closer to the truth than recognize and resist types. They at least realize that if you assert that the Novus Ordo hierarchy that is the legitimate hierarchy of the Catholic Church, you have to actually submit to them. In that way, though, indult types, or at least formerly indult types, are FSSP types, things like that. That group and groups like it, they are more consistent. They are closer to the truth in that way. In a way, they're farther because they also say that Vatican II contains nothing problematic, but they're closer to the truth in as much as at least that they are as they are consistent. So, Bossuet said many good things, but was also most definitely problematic. He tries into an apology for the declaration of the Gallican clergy, his defense of it. He tries to point out Pope Liberius as a reason for our position, essentially. That's his position, reason for the Gallican position on certain things. But even he had to remove that. It's Bossuet still, despite his problems as a Gallican, still has a fairly high reputation in certain ways. And realistically, some have, Darras for one thing, again, being French, and in this case, clearly though, opposing Bossuet, not trying to whitewash him completely, as Darras has a tendency to do. Still, he has a very definite liking for Bossuet on a certain level, and says, quoted in one of his later volumes of his work, his General History of the Church, says that I think he's quoting someone else who says it, but says that had he not been a Gallican, Bossuet would have been declared a father of the church, which is definitely an exaggeration. Fathers of the church are the doctors of the church for up to a certain point. But realistically, Bossuet would have stood a chance of being canonized had he not been a Gallican. To be a little more objective about it, he may well have been canonized had he not been a Gallican, but he was a Gallican, so it's not to say that he definitely lost his soul or anything, the fact that he's not canonized because of that, but the church will not hold up as a model for imitation someone who is clearly very badly wrong in a certain way. And so Bossuet said good things, but says some very good quotes. Was certainly eloquent, there's no question of that, but has this major problem of having been a Gallican. So he erased the whole passage concerning Pope Liberius from his own work as not proving conclusively enough what he wished at the moment to establish. So what Bossuet thought it his duty to erase from his treatise on the ecclesiastical power, we deem it proper to erase from the history of the Church. But 20 years of meditation and research have not enabled Bossuet to prove to his own satisfaction, we deem simply indemonstrable. We shall only remark here, from what we have just seen, that the Roman people could not endure Felix, because while he professed the belief of Nice, he still communicated with the Arians. That Pope Liberius entered Rome like a conqueror, that the people gave him a triumphal procession and drove out Felix. The fact of this conduct of the Roman people, in the face of this conduct of the Roman people, how can it be supposed that the same Pope Liberius had just disgraced himself before the Church by condemning St. Athanasius, by subscribing to Arianism, and by sending to the principal Arians letters of communion, as pitiful in style as they were abject in sentiment? We have seen the scandal to which the fall of Osius gave rise, the advantage taken of it by the Arians, and the striking reply of St. Fabadius of Agen. Now, if Liberius had likewise fallen, the scandal would have been much more horrible. The Arians would have proclaimed a greater triumph, and St. Fabadius would have found a much more urgent call for a reply. This utter silence on all hands conclusively prove the nullity of the fact. So, these are, of course, the conclusions with which Darus agrees. It may be objected that St. Athanasius refers to the fall of Liberius, both in his Apology against the Arians and in his History of the Arians, which latter work was addressed to the hermits. But it is universally granted that the Apology against the Arians was written at the very latest in 350 AD, 2 years before Liberius became pope. The passage which speaks of his fall is then evidently a subsequent addition made by a strange and unskillful hand. So strange meaning not necessarily saying odd things, but a stranger, somebody else interpolated this, somebody else inserted this for whatever reason. This made by a strange and unskillful hand, for far from giving any force to the apology, it makes it only pointless and ridiculous. The history of the Arians was also written at a period prior to that of the supposed fall of Pope Liberius. This unfavorable passage is then another interpolation, equally unconnected with what precedes and what follows. But by whom could these interpolations have been made? We know that even during the lifetime of St. Athanasius, the Arians forged a letter in his name to Constantius. So this is sometimes a problem. Various characters in the history of the church have had their, some saints even have had this problem of letters being written in their own names. Something along the lines of people's emails getting hacked into today. False messages getting sent out, scam messages or whatever getting sent out. Yet nothing new under the sun. There may not necessarily have been scams at the time, at least not in the same way. Scams are also nothing new, but may not have been scam letters being sent out, but false letters being sent out for whatever evil motives being sent, false messages being sent out in the name of various characters. Again, this has happened throughout history, and sometimes people who have had this problem or been aware of it and have said, I will put this or that code word or expression in my messages, in letters that actually come from me, so that you know that it's actually coming from me. When you detect this or word or this phrase, you know this is authentic. This has not been faked, because that can be a problem. I've even heard of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux had this problem, that his secretary somehow, who had apparently access to his seal, started sending out letters in his name, which it's terrible. That's sinful for someone to do that. Obviously, it also causes major problems for people's reputations, and sometimes it can be impossible when it comes to somebody who not just doesn't simply write letters, but who publishes whole works. This can become a real problem. For example, one figure we saw last year, Origen, who is not to be confused with Tertullian, although they're similar in certain ways. In other words, both prominent authors in the early history of the church, both of them referred to as being ecclesiastical authors, who are not to be confused with fathers of the church. Fathers of the church are doctors of the church for the first several centuries of the church. Ecclesiastical authors are those who are prominent in some way, whose writings in the early history of the church are prominent in some way and carry a certain authority. At least some of their writings carry a certain authority, but who are definitely not fathers of the church, because they're definitely not canonized. And Tertullian just became a heretic, and started saying, in fact, all kinds of stupid and absurd things. Origen was actually a lay catechist, but he was still someone whose writings carry a certain authority, but there are also very blatant errors in his works, some things that are terribly wrong. Darras gives lists of those. And but at the same time, so it's because of that he cannot be canonized, because it may well be that he put forth serious errors. But at the same time, he complained about his works being interpolated, people inserting things into his works. Again, at a time when it would have been difficult to find out who was doing it or what exactly was being inserted. It was just more difficult to do that, more difficult to keep tabs on such things at the time. Things were put out in a way that was just difficult for that to be determined. So exactly what Origen may have been perfectly orthodox in what he himself believed, but at the same time, maybe not. So he can't possibly be canonized, even if he said many good things, because of this problem. So this is not a new problem. It's not a new in our time. It's not new in this time of the history of the church that we're looking at. And sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to tell, when you have a work that has certainly had things inserted into it, who made the insertions. Or in some cases, it's difficult to tell even what has been inserted and what is actually coming from the author whose name the work bears. And keep in mind, this can also, misattributions of works can happen in, we'll say, in a way that is innocuous as well. Not to say that that's ever a good thing or it doesn't matter, but it sometimes can happen that a good work be misattributed to somebody who's may have said those things, or at least been in agreement with those things, but who's not actually the author of the work in question. For example, there's of course, very famous Saint Dionysius, or Saint Denis, who wrote many good things, but there's also a pseudo Dionysius, somebody, some other author whose true identity is not known, who said many good things, but whose works were mistakenly attributed to Saint Dionysius. Again, who the actual author is, we don't know. He was a good author, said good things, but we don't know who he actually is. We do know that his works were misattributed to Saint Dionysius, and so the only way of referring to him is the pseudo Dionysius, the fake Dionysius. Not to say that he was a fake author or anything like that. Not to say he was a sham. It's just that we don't know who he is. We don't know what his actual name was. And instead, we'll have to refer to him as the one who is not Dionysius. We have Saint Dionysius, who did actually say things, did actually write things, many good things, but also another author who is thought to have been him, but who was not. So, who is thought to have been he, but who was not. So, I refer to him as the pseudo Dionysius, which pseudo in Greek means fake. There is in fact the word in our Lord used, pseudo prophete, false prophets. There's one word, pseudo propheta, a false prophet. So in English, pseudo is the way that comes over. You drop the pronunciation of the S. and the diphthong is pronounced differently, but the pseudo Dionysius, the fake Dionysius, who was not a sham, not a bad author, just that's not his name. So you have to keep that in mind. That can happen. And sometimes it can be difficult, though, in the cases of interpolation, to tell where the interpolation exactly took place or who did it. So that's the case here. Nothing's really different here in the case of Saint Athanasius. We know that even during the lifetime of Saint Athanasius, that the Arians forged a letter in his name to Constantius. So sometimes it happens that different names get attributed to different people in interesting ways. For example, during, I forget when it is exactly, it's late summertime, but there are a few different, there's a day in which you have, I think, 3 different martyrs, feast of 3 different martyrs. And the 2 of those martyrs' names are known, but a third one was when the 2 were being taken to their martyrdom. A third man they were being taken past a crowd or something. A third man from the crowd said, "Oh, I'm a Christian also." And so he said, okay, those who were going to put these 2 martyrs to death, all right, we're going to kill you too. So he also suffered martyrdom with them, but his name it was unknown what his name was, so he's known as Saint Adauctus, which adaugio means to increase something. So he was the one who increased the number. He's the added one. That's all. He's just known as Saint Adauctus for that reason. And that's in the breviary itself. That's why he's called that, because we don't know what his name is. It's the only thing we can call him. So that can happen. That is definitely, things like that do happen all the time. So what could they have? So this letter there was certainly a forged letter sent in the name of Saint Athanasius to the Emperor Constantius. What could they do while he was alive was certainly easier, or an accomplishment. What they could do while he was alive was certainly easier of accomplishment after his death. So they could manage it while he's alive, certainly they could manage it while he's dead. Did not the Donatists invent a similar account of a fall on the part of Pope St. Marcellinus, which was long received, but which all critics now acknowledge as false? So this is an interesting case. Pope St. Marcellinus he's a martyr, Pope who's a martyr prior to St. Sylvester, so clearly a martyr. But it's actually in the breviary itself, in the lessons given for his life, that he fell to the error of the Donatists. He succumbed to pressure from them before repenting of it and then dying a martyr. That's in the breviary, but that's false actually. The breviary is not the details of the lives of the saints given in the breviary. Those are not intended as infallible declarations by the Church. It's not to be dismissed out of hand, anything contained in them. They are certainly, generally speaking, correct and well-researched and very, very thorough and, in fact, detailed, certainly as the lives of the saints in the breviaries, after the work done on them by Pope Leo XIII, he added a great amount of detail to them. So it's not to be dismissed out of hand by any means. These are accounts in the official liturgical prayer of the Church, to which we ought to pay attention, to take into account, to give them serious weight. But there's also, the Church does not say that it must be so closely adhered to as to be treated as though an infallible declaration. So when there's very serious reason to say this or that assertion put forward in the lives of the saints in the breviary is incorrect, then that may well be permissible to set it aside as being mistaken. And that's true. It's been retained. The account of Pope St. Marcellinus has been retained in the breviary, but that's in fact incorrect. And true critics. Now we're not talking about rationalists who look at perhaps an unusual use of a Greek particle in St. John's Gospel and say this must be false because of that. Not that kind of nonsense criticism, but true criticism. What are the actual historical documents concerning this or that assertion? What evidence is there for this or that? How did this or that notion come about? And sometimes there is reason to say that there's been a misunderstanding here. And so we'll set that aside and understand that that's incorrect. Now, that's generally accepted, that Pope St. Marcellinus did not actually fall the way that he is thought to have fallen, and that was due to the slanders of the Donatists, who wanted to make him appear as though one of them. And remember, this happens. Heretics do this kind of thing. St. Augustine, remember, we saw that last year, said that of St. Cyprian. St. Cyprian fell into a very similar error to the Donatists. And St. Augustine says that, well, for one thing, St. Cyprian is canonized, obviously. Clearly, falling into error is a very good reason to put off someone's canonization. But St. Cyprian was canonized even after clashing rather violently, in fact, with Pope St. Stephen I on the very question of whether heretics, those who were baptized by heretics, are to be rebaptized. Pope St. Stephen said no, obviously. St. Cyprian was very much of the opinion that yes, they should be, and they clashed violently. So St. Cyprian was... a lot of these people early in the history of the church, the writers from North Africa tended to be rather hot-headed. Tertullian, for example, was one of those hotheads who was so hot-headed he became a heretic. St. Cyprian was also from North Africa and hot-headed, and said all these nasty things about St. Stephen I. Things that look at that. How did he get canonized saying these things? But St. Augustine says that St. Augustine is convinced that St. Cyprian renounced that error, and that there was evidence for that, which was suppressed by the Donatists, who wanted to make it seem as though St. Cyprian was on their side. And coming from anybody else, we tend to be skeptical of that, but when St. Augustine says it, it's a little hard to argue with that. So St. Augustine is convinced that St. Cyprian disowned his error before then dying himself a martyr. And so we can safely say the same, that St. Cyprian, before dying, not only did he die a martyr's death, but died a martyr's death having explicitly renounced the error that he fell into. And it's interesting to look at it in detail that St. Cyprian actually saw that whole question as being a disciplinary question rather than a doctrinal one, which was a misunderstanding of the whole situation as well. But things that were not so clearly defined then as they are now. For example, you'll see, as we go along, we'll see examples of, I'll mention of ordinations being annulled, as though an ordination had never taken place. And of course, that's with the understanding that the character on the soul that is imprinted by a valid ordination can never be effaced. What is meant by that is that it is made as though this ordination legally had never taken place. Is essentially to blind the law of the church to the fact that this ordination took place. This man is no more permitted to exercise the orders that he has received any more than if he had actually never been ordained to begin with. That's the idea. And at the time, the language, disciplinary matters and doctrinal matters, the language concerning them was not so clearly distinguished as now. Now we would call that laicization. Taking someone who's clearly ordained a priest validly and reducing him legally to the lay state. And there's a whole list of ceremonies in the Roman Pontifical for reducing clerics of various levels to the lay state. So that's interesting to see, but if you ever want to look at that, but it's not something we can do. It's an act of jurisdiction to reduce a priest to the lay state. But it is something that was definitely done in the history of the church. Anybody misbehaved badly enough, he would be reduced to the lay state. So that is something to keep in mind. So, mentioned St. Cyprian in connection with the Donatists, in connection with St. Marcellinus, and all this is being brought up in connection with St. Athanasius and things that have been interpolated in his works. So, besides, the Arians were not the only enemies of Liberius. The Luciferian schismatics were quite as eager to defame him. So that's a reference to Lucifer of Cagliari, a bishop who went into schism at a certain point. In the words of Rufinus, written about 50 years after this period, we perhaps see the first dark spots on the horizon, foreboding the storm of calumny which was soon to break upon the head of Liberius. He says, Liberius, Bishop of Rome, had returned whilst Constantius was still alive, but I cannot positively state whether it was that he had consented to subscribe, or that the emperor would please the Roman people, who at his departure had begged this favor. Rufinus was a priest of Aquileia, so it bringing up this notion that maybe Liberius signed onto something given to him by the Arians. So, Rufinus was a priest of Aquileia. In his youth, he may have known Liberius. He had certainly known Fortunation, the bishop of Aquileia, to whom the fall of Liberius is imputed. Remember, someone who urged him to sign this ambiguous declaration, give it an orthodox interpretation, and make things a little bit better for yourself. Rufinus knows nothing of it, undoubtedly because the calumny was only beginning to be spread abroad. For if Liberius had actually signed an Arian formula, had he actually penned the pitiful letters of defection ascribed to him, the Arians, who were, it says all-powerful, that's a little exaggerated, who had high influence, would have left no one in ignorance of the fact. Remember, the Donatists, according to St. Augustine, suppressed evidence that St. Cyprian abjured an error very similar to theirs. The Arians certainly would not have failed to take advantage of a pope succumbing to their pressure. They would have shouted from the rooftops, as they say. It would have been impossible for Rufinus to entertain any doubt upon the subject. So if it had happened, he'd have known it for a fact, in other words. So the Greek monology relates the facts as we have given them. It speaks as follows. The blessed Liberius, defender of the faith, was Bishop of Rome under the empire of Constantius. Burning with zeal for the Orthodox faith, he protected the great Athanasius, persecuted by the heretics for his bold defense of the truth, and driven from Alexandria. Of course, remember, multiple times St. Athanasius was driven from Alexandria. Whilst Constantine and Constans lived, the Catholic faith was supported, but when Constantius was left sole master, as he was an Arian, the heretics prevailed. Liberius, for his vigor in censuring their impiety, was banished to Berea in Thrace. But the Romans, the actual inhabitants of the city of Rome, who always remained the faithful there, who remained always true to him, went to the emperor and besought his recall. Besought him, as we saw, to bring back the true pope to Rome. He was therefore, on this account, sent back to Rome, and there ended his life, after a holy administration of his pastoral charge. So, clearly, with this statement before us, giving the facts and substantiating arguments of both parties with equal impartiality, it cannot be hard to form a conscientious opinion. So, this is Darras concluding that he's saying we have no wish either to solicit or to bias, but he says it will suffice to end this discussion with the solemn words of Bossuet, whose name we quote the more readily, as its authority has so often been invoked against the prerogatives of the Holy See. So this is even the Gallican has to say this, or whom, notice, Darras still refers to him as illustrious, this illustrious prelate. Leaving that aside, so we can still quote even the Gallican as saying, though one or two sovereign pontiffs, contrary to the custom of their predecessors, should either from violence or surprise have failed in maintaining the faith with sufficient constancy, or in explaining its doctrines with perfect clearness, still personal errors could make no impression on the chair of Peter. Not more traceless are the waters which a ship has cleaved in its passage. So, in other words, with regard to matters of teaching on faith and morals, as the Holy See, just as a ship leaves absolutely no mark on the waters through which it passes, so also the Holy See has left absolutely perfect all matters of teaching and faith and morals throughout time. This is an example of Bossuet's eloquence. That's quite a nice image with which to illustrate just how perfectly the Holy See has always maintained its teachings in matters of faith and morals. Again, this abstracting from whether, as I know as he says, that some predecessors, some sovereign pontiffs have, against the usual conduct of the vicars of Christ on earth, some have failed to maintain the faith with sufficient constancy or explain its doctrines with perfect clearness. So yes, there might be some cases in which this or that pope is accused of not, for example, fanning the flames of heresy through negligence. That's usually said of Pope Honorius, for example, fanning flames of heresy through negligence, failing to be sufficiently clear. Even if that is true, then still there is nothing ever taught by the Holy See contrary to faith or morals. And certainly there have been popes who have had terrible reputations as far as their personal conduct goes, and some of those might be deserved. Pope Alexander VI was the first one who comes to mind. You could make a pretty good case that his bad reputation was not deserved, actually. And keep in mind, that's the one, pretty much reading Darras, Pope Alexander VI is about the one pope whose personal life he admits is blameworthy. Now that's Darius, who likes to whitewash anybody he likes. Pope Alexander VI, he goes after him just as much as anybody else does. But there are actually other authors, even authors who are not Catholic, who say that was all just a smear campaign against him. So you can make a pretty good case for that. This was all an Italian gossip smear campaign against a Borgia pope. Yeah, the Borgias were a Spanish family, and they didn't like the fact that a Borgia had been elected pope. And so the authors, the historians who debate the usual story concerning Alexander VI, say that it's all traced back ultimately to one source, to a single priest who was apparently a bit of a gossip column, and from whom all those assertions come. And that's that. Beyond that, there's no evidence for it. Certainly, and for one thing, again, Pope Alexander VI, all of the accusations are purely on the basis of his personal life. Nothing at all concerning his government of the church. And in fact, as governing the church, he actually did quite well. He was certainly no worse than the other pope in the same time. And in fact was clearly looked to by the entire Catholic world for decisions, even in things that were not matters of faith and morals. For example, he drew the famous papal line of demarcation. Spain and Portugal had a certain debate over where to draw their territorial lines in the New World, their imperial boundaries in the New World, and so they turned to the Pope for a decision on that. That's not a decision that pertains to matters of faith or morals. It's purely political. Imperial boundaries, but even so, they turned to the Pope for that, and they clearly had no problem turning personally to Pope Alexander VI to draw that line. So, just goes to show that it has nothing to do whatsoever with his government of the church. Not only nothing to do with matters of teaching and faith and morals, but nothing whatsoever even to do with his government of the church, his administration of things during his pontificate. So, the constant excitement caused by the Arians wrangling, the Arian wrangling on questions of dogma soon split the public mind into different hostile factions. Heresy cannot free itself from the consequence of its fundamental law. It must, by its very nature, undergo continual change. Okay, we'll continue with that next time. Some interesting things to unpack there, for sure. Right. Spiritus Sancti, amen. Subituum presidium contrugibus, Sancta Dei Genitrix